nerfs have been announced, and I think 13 cards are being changed in constructed formats, including some big ones like Mr. Smite going from 6 to 7 mana. This has been one of the most requested nerfs I've ever seen on YouTube. A ton of you out there hate Mr. Smite, and you may be thinking, wait a minute, this doesn't really change the Nelly interaction, but we're going to get to Nelly. Nelly got to change too. If you hate Nelly, just wait. But Mr. Smite going to 7 does still have an impact in other decks as just that finisher tool. If you think about things like Rogue, for instance, using this with the boat card, Asharin, Sunken Vessels, and using all that to get a ton of burst damage on turn 6 or turn 7, sometimes with Mr. Smite and a Dredge hitting you for like 12. Also, we've got things like Paladin using Mr. Smite as a finisher with various hand buff activators for him, and just general use aggro decks too, tossing him in at the top of the curve to give them that kind of Leroy effect. So pushing this back a mana will limit some of that burstiness and lethality for a bunch of those decks. Now, this does not inherently impact Nelly itself, but Nelly got a huge nerf too. Here is Nelly, and this is a crazy change. Now Nelly is just going to make the pirates you pick cost 1 less. Not cost 1, cost 1 less. So that's right, Mr. Smite will now cost 6 mana off of Nelly, like the old full cost Mr. Smite. It'll go from 7 to 6. And all those like crazy 3-drop pirates will just go to 2 mana instead of 1. So suddenly, instead of Nelly giving you this like crazy 3 mana follow-up play, you're often going to be using your entire turn if you want to play those 3 pirates. So it's much less about the mana cheat. There's maybe still a little, but not crazy amounts of mana cheat, making this, you know, way less scary for those like Smite pop-offs that exist, because you got to spend 6 on Smite and then maybe 2 or 3 mana on any additional pirates to support it. That's going to be much harder, but also just less swings in general. Even if you didn't get like a Smite lethal push, you're going to have to pay almost full mana for a bunch of sometimes mediocre pirates that don't necessarily contribute to your game plan. So that might retain some utility for things like Quest Pirate Warrior, but the general use case where you can toss this into any warrior deck and it becomes a really good card, because sometimes it's just lethal, sometimes it's just crazy value or swing, I think that goes away, because playing full price for pirates isn't really worth it, and paying 7 mana for, you know, a couple mediocre bodies here isn't really going to be worth it. I think this change is so significant, Nelly might go away altogether unless you just really, really care about pirates. And that's not all for Warrior. From the Depths is going to go to 4 mana from 3. This is one of the most powerful cards in Warrior, has an insane mulligan win rate. When Warriors play this on 3, it feels almost impossible to win in many cases, because it allows them to cheat out like really big stuff far too early in the game. So by pushing this back a mana, you're both delaying their ability to get those cheat cards down sooner, but also making them commit more mana if they want to do that in the first place. So for instance, you know, playing this on turn 3, maybe your opponent hasn't really amassed a big board. That down turn perhaps isn't too punishing, but if your opponent has a nice board assembled by turn 4, you kind of pass your turn for the 4 mana from the Depths. You might just take an extra 10 or 15 damage because you're just doing nothing on turn 4. And sometimes that's going to be a real punish for From the Depths. And it means no crazy plays like Rokara on turn 4, for instance. Suddenly it's about Rokara on turn 5 or Tidal Revenant on turn 5, as opposed to getting them down a little sooner. So giving every deck just that little bit more wiggle room to get in under the From the Depths discounts, which I think will help. Now that said, Rokara on 5 and Tidal Revenant on 5 are both still pretty good plays, although Tidal Revenant is getting nerfed, for the record. So I do think From the Depths is going to be a solid card, just not like the crazy super high win rate card that it is today. So let's just talk about Tidal Revenant. Never in my dreams did I think this would be a card that gets nerfed, but sure enough, Tidal Revenant's getting nerfed. It's going to go from 8 armor to 5 armor. And in the scheme of things, I think that's a pretty minimal nerf. I don't think that's going to really hurt this card too much. It does matter for Warrior, who's using that armor to do things like enable shield slams and sometimes shield shatter discounts. Those kinds of plays are important for Warrior, so it's meaningful, it's notable. I just don't think it is so bad that it kills this card. I think in many cases you're still going to be pretty happy to play the Tidal Revenant and gain 5 armor, because this card is doing a lot, and believe it or not, it's an awesome card, which I don't think many of us expected. So small change here to Tidal Revenant, which I don't know if it's necessary, because Warrior's getting so many changes. We're not even done with the Warrior changes yet, but I can certainly live with it. And then our final Warrior change is Shield Shatter, going from 5 damage to 4 damage. And this is one of the really most powerful cards in Warrior. Just enables you to clear so many boards basically for 0 mana in many cases. And that locks a ton of decks out of the game. It discourages board-based gameplay altogether. It's hard for any board-based decks that don't rely on things like Divine Shield to play around Shield Shatter at all. So I think reducing the power level of this one is important. Frankly, still probably going to be a good card at 4 damage. I think this remains good, but any deck that has 5 health threats in particular might be nice. Things like we talked about Spite Lash Siren in particular. Those kinds of decks can get around this breakpoint pretty nicely at 4, although Spite Lash Siren is getting nerfed. So stay tuned. I keep teasing other cards being nerfed. So all in all, probably still an awesome card, probably really strong card. Just those occasional, small incremental changes where this hurts you in a game or two, lowering percentages just a hair. That's kind of the nerfs we need. Now that said, altogether, this is a lot of nerfs for Warrior. I mean, these are a ton of changes. So Warrior's going to be in a weird spot. They're already, depending on the rank bracket, not really the best deck for Control Warrior. And they just got their 4 best cards all impacted. I mean, some are more notable than other in regards to nerfs. Like Nelly, I think, is a huge nerf. The others are going to stay, I think, pretty playable. But when you add all that together, that's a really big change. I think Warrior falls off very hard here. I'm surprised they went against this many cards for Warrior. I would have maybe just picked 1 or 2 and see how it went. But this is a major nerf. What do you guys think? Is this too far? Did they kill my boy Warrior? This is a lot. I don't know. All right, so since I teased it, let's talk about the Spite Lash Siren here. Spite Lash is going up a mana and gaining a health to boot. So from 4 to 5 mana, this is essentially going to push back those Spite Lash Sirens turns by 1. And I think this makes sense as you nerf things like Control Warrior and other decks. The kind of second tier of decks are all going to gain ground, so slowing those down can help keep things a little more flat as well. You don't want the next level of decks to rise up and be the new terrors of the meta, so preemptively nerfing things that don't currently look like crazy decks, although at high levels of play, Spite Lash Siren can be pretty busted, and I certainly hate playing against these like spam cycle mage decks over and over again. And I looked at the data for Spite Lash Siren. Pushing it back a mana looks like it's going to have a fairly large impact. The difference between playing a Siren on 5 and 6 right now is a 7% win rate fall off. And of course, this is really going to be more about playing it on turn 6 at the earliest, because you often need another card, a 1-mana Naga, to enable the Siren to get started. So you're not really playing it on 4. This will push it back to 6 and 7, which that's pretty far into a game for a board-based strategy to try to swing a game and win. Because this doesn't just like insta-win combo. It's really about building out that board of stuff. You can get some damage out of it, but I do worry this makes Spite Lash Siren pretty bad. Now, if every other deck gets slower, maybe that's fine, but ultimately just building a threat board of Nagas probably isn't going to do a lot by the time you get to turn 6 or 7. Other decks will be way out ahead of you on aggro or just getting all the tools they need to win the game late. So we'll see, but I don't have a lot of faith for Siren at 5. All right, the next change here, this one hurts me a little, but Cariel's going to 8 mana, pushing the hero card back here by a turn, and it's fair. I get it. A lot of people hate playing against Cariel, particularly anybody who's playing a more aggressive deck or damage-based deck. This one can feel pretty dang frustrating, and it's got absurd win rates for all the different variations of Paladin that are really good right now in the meta, so it makes sense. I just love this style of play. I love slow, grindy, control-style decks and games, and Cariel allows you to do that. Pushing it back gives time for other decks to get in under the Cariel, kill you before you stabilize behind all this defensive utility, which is probably ultimately a good change, even if it's one I don't personally love. All right, so Demon Hunter is another big target here. A couple nerfs for Demon Hunter. First up, Karya Fellsoul's going to 7 mana, getting some stats to go with that increase in cost, which is always nice, but pushing back the Z-Log summon for Fell Demon Hunter decks right now. Turns out getting a Z-Log on 6 is pretty oppressive when you've already had a really good, nice opening curve. Now, this wasn't what I was really expecting until I looked at the data. It just has really good win rates. Both Mulligan and Drawn win rates are super high for Karya, as we talked about in our previous video. So it does make sense to me now. And I did look at even more data. The fall off for this on turn 6 to turn 7 when it gets played is about an 8% win rate drop. It has a 66% win rate when played on 6. And on turn 7 drops to 58. So that turn slower impact is going to be pretty substantial for this card. Now, that doesn't mean the deck itself loses 8% just in games where this was getting played, but that's still going to add up to quite a few extra losses on the back of this change. So it might just be one turn, but it seems like it's a pretty important one. You kind of need to start turning the corner with that Z-Log damage as soon as possible, I think, to make it worth it. Does that mean Karya gets cut? Not necessarily. It still looks like a good turn 7 play, but definitely makes the deck a little weaker. We've got another change for Demon Hunter here with the Battle-Worn Vanguard going from a 2/2 to a 2/1. So essentially, notably easier to kill, many different ping effects, rogue weapons, etc. We'll be able to take out the Battle-Worn Vanguard, or just like 1 damage AoEs now suddenly both address the Fell Wings and the Vanguard itself. So greatly reducing its ability, I think, to survive across multiple turns and really start to snowball. That said, still some good, like, initial upside on this. Often you're still going to get 3 bodies out of this for 2 mana, which can be great in its own right. And frankly, not every deck has a great answer even at 1 health. Or if they do, it might be an inefficient one like a Hero Power. So probably still a pretty good card, I'd say, even at 1 health. It's not going to run away with games as easily, but still probably feels like a really good early game option that's helping you build out some nice stats. So all in all, I think Vanguard remains playable, just again, a little weaker. And here we have Wild Paw Knoll. He keeps getting nerfed and then rebuffed and then nerfed. Snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap. He's going back to a 3/5, staying at 5 mana for now, going to a 3/5 though, so making him less threatening on board, essentially, chipping in a little bit less damage, and various rogue decks are using this to great success. I still think a 3/5 is going to be pretty insane in many cases. Like, that's not going to change his ability to trade into stuff. He's coming down so early in the game. Usually he's not really sniping off 4 health stuff very often anyway. So it's still going to be an efficient like tempo swing in the early game. It reduces face damage a little. That adds up, right? Like, you might miss a few extra damage points over the course of a game with these Knolls at 3, but how often is that going to be a significant difference? I still think this is going to remain a really good card when it comes down early, which maybe that's what they wanted, just taking the edge off a little without totally killing the card. That's often a fine philosophy for nerfs. So there's one other neutral card getting nerfed. School Teacher is going down to a 4/3, otherwise staying the same. This is actually the most played card right now in Hearthstone. Super popular, honestly, at like Zilliax levels of play. And I think a nerf in that case is reasonable. I don't think, on the same hand, though, that this was a card a lot of people were worried about or complaining about necessarily. It feels bad in Warrior with like From the Depths, but with From the Depths getting nerfed to 4, it's no longer in the School Teacher pool, so maybe that would have fixed some of the problems for the crazy power spikes of School Teacher that we see right now. So this one's not an important change to me. I don't think I would have asked for this. I was fine as a 5/4. Honestly, think it stays pretty good as a 4/3 as well, though. The stat line on this was nice, but it often wasn't the most important aspect of the card. It's really what you could do with the Nogglings that was most important for various decks. And brand shenanigans with those, like Spite Lash, Siren enablers, that remains the case for School Teacher as a 4/3. Nogglings are still really good. Duplicating all the extra spells you care about still happens. So I think this is still a really good card. There may be a deck here and there that cuts it because they care about the stats enough if they're like a little bit more aggressively aligned. But all in all, still a high utility card. I think that gets played. All right, so this one surprised me. Earthen Scales is going to 2 mana. We don't see a lot of Druid right now in the meta, but I will say Earthen Scales has been one of the more frustrating cards for people from what I've heard. Namely on the back of cards like Ibis. You get those gigantic 30+ Ibises, then you innervate an Earthen Scales on said Ibis, and you get that gigantic 30+ armor total on the back of just a 1 mana card, which can often lock out games. Sometimes your only hope against those Ibis plays is like, it's okay, I'm gonna go over the top and I'm gonna fireball them in the face and they'll be dead. And it's like, oh, actually, no, sorry, bro, I have 36 life now instead of just 6. Get wrecked on Earthen Scales. So a little bit harder to pull that off at 2 mana. You'd have to use like double innervates or some other sort of mana cheat to enable that right now. Also, just, outside of the crazy Ibis scenarios, this just slows down the Earthen Scales in the mid game. Sometimes, turn 8 or 9, they play a Naga Giant and rip a single Earthen Scales because they have that 1 spare mana. Maybe now that happens a turn later, or they miss the Earthen Scales, and that enables you to kill them. So this was a very efficient, high output card for 1 mana. I think it's pretty reasonable to see this get increased in cost just to prevent any future problems, because Druid might be one of those decks that rises and fills up the gaps in the meta from the other nerfs. And then finally, we have a wild nerf I thought I'd include. There are also some big battleground changes. I'm not going to run through all those, of course. I'll link the patch notes in the description down there. Might be a little delayed, but stay tuned for those. But one other wild nerf I wanted to talk about, Lightning Bloom. I've asked for this change literally for like 2 years. I've always thought Lightning Bloom was insane, and I've always said make it refresh mana crystals. That way you still have 2 mana for 0. It still has that utility, but you can't cheat things out early because you're still capped at your normal mana cost. So right now in wild format, this is being utilized in big shaman decks to cheat out like muck morphers into Yashirajas, into crazy plays, and apparently it's wreaking havoc on wild, which is why we're seeing this nerf finally. But that's always been the case with Lightning Bloom. I'm going to play my thing like 2 or 4 turns earlier than I'm supposed to be able to play my big thing. So now instead, yes, you can increase your total mana cost in a given turn, but you can't exceed your mana cap because of the refresh here. So this becomes kind of an inverse mana biscuit for Mage. And yeah, that's going to help keep in check some of the craziness available to cheat out big plays, which is clearly something Wild needs. And I think this is a great change, one I've asked for forever. Lightning Bloom's just a completely bonkers card. So happy this change finally happened. Yeah, there you go. That's it. 13 card changes in this patch. That's pretty crazy. That's a lot. I am very curious how the meta is going to shake out. Warrior seems like it got murdered. I mean, not all the changes are enormous, but there's just a lot, and that's going to stack up. That's going to add up, right? Mr. Smite got changed. Cariel got changed. So many really notable cards in this patch. So curious to hear what everybody thinks about these nerfs. What would you have done differently? What are you excited to try out? What do you think is going to be hurt the most? I want to hear those thoughts and more in the comments below. But until then, thanks so much for watching. And until next time, game on.